Police station, I could see down the hallway. They're all jumping up, high-fiving each other, lighting cigars, celebrating that they had arrested Darlie. And I just told them, I said, you guys, y'all got the wrong person. You guys are making a big mistake.
We did a poll earlier, about 76% of people do think she's guilty. Our viewers who were voting in that poll, with a small percentage believing she's innocent. Has there ever been a moment that gave you pause to think perhaps she is innocent?
No, in fact, it was a strong circumstantial evidence case.
Hey, it's Sully, Jones, and Johnson, and this is Kitchen Table Research, where we do the research so you don't have to. Our recent Routier episodes have been amazing and super well received by our fans, so I'm glad that you guys are liking these episodes. I still have it out on the table, that if you rate, review, and subscribe, I will send you a spooky gift, and so just shoot me an email if you do that to kitchen.table.research@gmail.com.
We also have a new subscriber, so shout out to Needmo22.
Need mo. It's so glad to have you with us, Needmo. We'd love to hear your thoughts about these Routier episodes, and anyone else out there that's listening, shoot us an email. Let me know what you think, or let me know if you have come across any other info, since this case goes back almost 30 years now. Jones is going to go ahead and give you guys a synopsis of the last episode that we talked about, and where we did our opening statements, both for the prosecution and the defense. And then she's just going to jump right in and start presenting her side of the story, which would be the defense, Mad Dog Mulder representing Darlie Routier versus the state of Texas. And we will pick up there. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jones.
Hello to True Crime Aficionados. I'm Jones, and I will be acting as the defense for this podcast. The scenario that the prosecution needs you to believe is based on theory. It's not based on scientific evidence. There is a second story that also contains circumstantial evidence, but contains much more truth than the fabricated story that the prosecution wants you to believe. Our defense team will provide rebuttals and alternative theories for the fingerprint evidence, the blood evidence, the wound evidence, etc., that the prosecution spoke about. In fact, Darlie's story of an intruder makes much more sense, and the defense will provide testimony which supports that intruder story. The prosecution provides a motive that Darlie is all about herself and wanted the boys out of her life. Let's talk about this motive. The Routiers had $5,000 each life insurance on each child, and the funeral cost more than $10,000. Darren had a policy of around $750,000. The boys' life insurance did not even cover the cost of the funeral, so that doesn't appear to be a likely motive. Maybe the intruder should have killed Darren instead, since he had a $750,000 life insurance policy. The media incorrectly reported the life insurance amount on the boys and again fueled the Darlie witch hunt. In fact, the family was making plans. They were going to go visit Darlie's relatives in Pennsylvania within 2 weeks for a wedding, and then they also planned to renew their own vows planned in August. So money wasn't her motive. Ms. Routier did exactly what was asked of her from the police officer and from Darren when they were on the scene. Darren knew enough not to turn Damon from his backside to his front side because of increased risk of bleeding, and Darlie did not know CPR. Darren and then police officer Waddell arrived and asked her to get towels and place on Damon's back to control bleeding. If the belief of the prosecutor is that Darlie stabbed Damon, then why didn't Damon show any fear of Darlie when she was attending to him?
So one of the things I came across while I was reading testimony or a narrative from Darlie is that she was a stay-at-home mom and she watched daytime television. So Darlie is listening to one of these programs one day and they are talking about how to stop bleeding if you're ever in an emergency. And she learned from that program that the best way to stop bleeding was to use a wet towel because it is cleaner than using a dry towel. Now, today, of course, the medical industry is always changing. Today, we know that dry towels are best to staunch bleeding. So, if you're ever in a situation where you have somebody bleeding out, the best thing you can do is hold a dry rag or towel or t-shirt as tightly as you can across that wound. Now, holding a wet towel honestly wouldn't be the end of the world. The main focus, I believe, is the pressure. This is the reason that Darlie used wet towels when she was providing life-saving measures to the boys.
Let's talk about the gag order. It seems that the judge's gag order has been violated multiple times by Mrs. Routier's friends and family, and Judge Tully has had the Routier family into his courtroom prior to the trial starting to charge them with violating his gag order. Actually, the violation of Judge Tully's gag order has occurred on both sides. As reported to the defense, a prosecutor was having a phone conversation about this trial in the middle of the Kerrville courthouse, obviously a violation of the gag order. Judge Tully denied the defense's request to dismiss the trial based on multiple gag order violations by the parties in this case. So that's kind of his beginning statements as to why are we even here. This violation of the gag order was the basis for the first request for a mistrial, which Tully denied.
So this is taken from the court transcripts, and this is how Brantley is introduced in the courtroom. You are an FBI agent, is that correct? I'm a supervisory special agent with the FBI, that is correct. And how many years have you been an FBI agent? About 13 and a half years. Okay. Would you acquaint the court with your educational background and experience? Excuse me, Mr. Mulder. Judge, this is outside the scope of a 705 hearing. A 705 hearing is only to elicit his opinions and then what the underlying factors are for those opinions. Sustained. Let's get right into the opinions. Ask what the opinions are and the basis for them, please.
So that's part of what Mr. Brantley and kind of the tone of the entire courtroom proceedings when the defense gets up to defend Darlie. And we're trying to portray that as rude as the courtroom appeared to be in the trial between Judge Mulder and the attorneys. There's a request.
Judge Tully.
Yeah, Judge Tully. Sorry. There is also a request for a mistrial number 2. The defense asked for a second motion for mistrial based on these 3 points. First of all, FBI agent Brantley relied on third-party statements to build his testimony. They were not his original thoughts nor his original findings. And that's what the 705 hearing was about. It also violates Dober and Fry, and we're going to get into that. The second reason that he asked for a mistrial by denying the introduction of other evidence. So number 2, they denied the court to cross-examine Mr. Brantley when they released him from the stand. And number 3 is the defense wanted to introduce the medical psych records from Barbara Jovel's psychiatric hospitalization. Again, Judge Tully denied that. We feel the prosecution has failed to satisfy their burden of proof. And does the state really have enough proof to present a case to the judge and jury? Bevel, another blood expert, nor Brantley, who we've already talked about, can draw any possible conclusions by looking at the unmarked photographs.
So Johnson is going to tell you a little bit about what the Dalbert standard and the Fry standard are in a courtroom. Go ahead, Johnson.
So, as a very general overview, Fry was the first standard to be initiated in the court system. And what Fry focuses on is solely whether or not an expert's opinion or a new kind of quote unquote science is generally accepted by the scientific community. Daubert, which was initiated later on, focuses more on specific factors as well as is it generally accepted, such as is the methodology that was used to create this new technique valid? Things like that. Has there been peer reviews and publications? What
Or
are the error rates?
or like you create a hypothesis that you then test against, and so other, say, scientists could replicate that testing, but that's not how they did that, and so that does violate, Johnson is saying, the Daubert standard, because if you're going to introduce something in court like a science experiment, say the one that Bevel did on top of the crime scene, it should be written in a way that another blood analysis expert could come in and replicate that experiment, correct? Is that
Yeah.
how I understand it? Am I right, Johnson?
Well, that's part of it, but yeah, replication is like probably one of the most important parts of any science at all, ever.
And so we had talked about last episode that he did not use blood. He used paint, which is a different viscosity. Second of all, he did no measurements. He did not write down what he did. And their camera just somehow seemed to fail. Again, how many cameras have we had fail in this case? Again. And so the entire experiment was not photographed correctly. And they used the same photographer that photographed the crime scene. And today, Jones is going to deep dive into that a little bit more for us. So, do you have anything else to say about that, Johnson?
I'm not sure what the sentence means. Ties into Brantley in particular, although it occurs several times.
I think that we are saying that Brantley's testimony is his own opinions. It's not based in a scientific fact. It's not based on his own experiences. We just talked about how bad the photography was in this case, and so I'm going to hand it back over to Jones.
Well, Brantley's kind of useless.
Yeah, so basically at the end of the day, prosecution brings in an FBI agent who testifies, and his testimony is basically useless because it does not meet the Daubert standard, and it is a motion for mistrial, but of course Judge Tolley denies this. So I'm going to
It doesn't even try either, because it is not generally accepted that profiling does anything.
Right, and this is why, like you said, that you can't have lie detector tests. We've discovered how bad eyewitness testimony is in court, and so some of this stuff has been ruled inadmissible as we learn more about the human psyche and as our crime and justice system moves forward. We've learned several things, like I said, including that eyewitness testimony isn't really reliable. Lie detector tests aren't 100%. And so that's why some of these things are not admissible into court. But another thing that that the prosecution fails to do is take good photographs. And so I'm going to hand it back over to Jones, and she's going to get into photography.
Okay, let's get into the photography of the scene. The police sent a fairly novice photographer to the scene early in the morning of June the 6th. Photographers are taught specific angles and shots, and crime photographers are taught to process forensic photographic evidence. They are also taught to label each photograph. Where's it taken? What corner of the room was it taken? The angle it was taken. There are no labels that accompany the photographs the defense received from the prosecution. And today, as far as I know, there are still no identifications in the photographic evidence. So if the prosecution had the same trouble matching this evidence to the crime scene, then the value of any photographic evidence becomes non-existent, in my humble opinion. Let's talk about a specific example. Testimony describes the window in the garage as raised up 5 inches. But when you go through the photographs of the garage window, the window photographed is up about 18 inches. This is an example of that photographer's shoddy work.
I just want to state that when I was going through the photographs and the pictures, Darren testifies that he raise the window 6 to 8 inches. It was cut into a T, and the top of that T is at about 6 to 8 inches, in which then he cuts the screen, sticks his arm through, lifts the window up higher, and then crawls through it. I think that the problem is we just don't know, because those photographs were taken after those police walked in and out of that screen. And another thing that we just don't know is, was the screen cut from the inside or the outside? There's been a lot of debate about this, but really, according to the pictures, you don't know, because they took pictures after they fumbled around with this window. And so in pictures that we will post, and I'll make sure that we put a special note next to them, you can go count the bricks, and somehow the window gets raised all the way up to about 24 inches or 2 feet, which is enough for somebody to climb through it. This is one example of, was that window raised like that, or did the police raise it? Now we have fingerprints that we're going to get into that are found on that window. And so we believe that the intruder did cut it at the 6 to 8 inch mark, and then reached his hand inside and lifted that window up to about 24 inches. Now I'm going to turn it back over, and Jones is going to give you a brief perspective of the Barbara Jovell testimony according to the defense.
So Barbara Jovell, who is supposedly and is introduced as Darlie's best friend, I want to question that assumption. Barbara Jovell may have been a former best friend of Darlie's, but I don't think she was the night that all this happens. I think the prosecution certainly wants you to believe that they're best friends because it gives more credence to Barb's testimony, but they are not the best of friends at the time of the crime. With 3 children under 7, Darlie had turned her attention from test-neck, which is their business, to mothering her children. Barb was jealous of this because she expected a raise and more responsibility at test-neck, but Barb did not receive the adulation she thought she deserved. It opened the door for jealousy against Darlie. In fact, Darren states that he's one of the few people that can talk to Barbara Jovell without her getting angry. He also testifies that she's lost a couple of jobs due to her anger and her inability to team play. So Darlie's true best friend was Melanie Waits, and she is going to testify later in the trial. And as far as I know, and up until recently, Melanie visits Darlie in jail and has for the last 25 years. Barbara Jovell has never visited Darlie in jail. Melanie Waits' immediate advice was to get an attorney immediately, and that didn't happen. And that may be one of the downfalls of this case.
All right, so just like in the last episode that we did for the prosecution, we are going to go basically in the same order. We're going to go through some of the testimony, and then we'll get into finally forensics.
Finally, forensics.
Jones is going to present the defense's side of this case. And again, remember that we are taking all the information from 1996 to this day, and we are including it all so that you guys have a full picture of what has gone down in the last 25 years in this case. Let me turn it over to Jones. She's going to lead this episode, as we stated, and so she'll be doing quite a bit of talking here.
There has been some confusion during testimony about the funeral, the burial, the prayer service, the memorial service, and the boys, and the birthday party for Devin. On the day Darlie was released from the hospital, so 2 days after the crimes, she and Darren went into the side entrance of the funeral home to be alone with the boys' bodies. Darlie and Darren were alone with the boys, and Darlie absolutely broke down in tears, and she cried, and she cried, and she cried. The mourners that were out in the funeral foyer could hear her sobs. The next morning, I think, the boys were buried, and a week later, there was an early morning memorial service that was attended by close friends and family, and the boys were laid to rest. It happened to be Devin's 7th birthday, and Darlie's family thought it would be a great idea to celebrate Devin's birthday. And his favorite song was gangster rap, and his favorite thing to do was Getcha with Silly String. Okay? So that afternoon, the family returned to the gravesite for Devin's 7th birthday.
Well, let me talk about, because this gets very convoluted and confusing. So, like Mom said, there is actually 2 recordings that happen the day that they lay the boys to rest at the graveside service. So, if you've ever been to a funeral, you know that there's normally the family goes in and sees the body and takes any mementos. Then there's a funeral service. Then the casket is closed. They are buried. And normally you go out to the gravesite on the same day. Now, I think because Darlie and Darren were dealing with so much, and Darlie had just gotten out of the hospital, that they pushed that gravesite service out a week so that family could come in and everybody could get together and they could get their preacher from the church and everybody to attend this vigil, if you will. So, first of all, there's 2 different recordings. There is an audio recording that is planted by police in the bushes near where the grave is. And so when the pastor presides over the funeral at the grave site, the family does not know that the police has planted a mic in there. I don't know what the police thought they were going to hear. I don't know if they thought Darlie was going to go up to the gravestone and confess all of her sins right there and then. But at any rate, the legality of this is a little bit confusing. So since they had invited the public to be a part of this, it made this a public forum, and therefore the police were technically within their legal limits to plant this device. Now, if this had been a private event, it would have changed the legality, and that would have been illegal for them to plant that. So we have the audio, it's an audio only, of the preacher speaking and the family at the gravesite that morning. Fast forward, they go home, they change clothes. Some of the kids that were too young to really go to this gravesite service and understand all of this were then invited back later that afternoon to celebrate Devin's birthday. So somebody in the Routier family, I think it was Dana or Dawn, called the media to come record Devin's 7th birthday. And her motive behind this was to make the children that had lost their friends feel more at peace. Secondly, to celebrate Devin's life and try to calm the community's fears that there was a serial killer running loose on the streets. So we do have the audio recording that we've never found. It must have got thrown in a box. I don't know where it is. We've never heard anything from that audio, but obviously the police didn't hear anything from that audio either because it was never put into discovery during the trial. Now, everybody, if you know this case, has seen the news footage of Darlie spraying the silly string. So remember that she's smacking gum, she's spraying silly string, she has on short shorts and a tight little top. And people think that her outfit is out of line, but it's 100 degrees out. The reason that Darlie is chewing gum is because the medication she's on is giving her dry mouth. And really, she says the whole event was so foggy to her that she really almost doesn't even remember the event. And if you've been to a funeral, if you've lost somebody unexpectedly, I think that you can kind of understand how she's feeling. On that note, we just want you guys to remember that there's an audio recording from the police, and then there is video and audio news footage that was released by whatever news station it was. So now Jones is going to take us through some of the events, we're going to do this in the same order I presented the prosecution in. So Jones is going to talk for quite a bit here, and I'm going to hand the mic back over to her.
Okay, so the first thing is life-saving measures. You know, the police kind of dig into Darlie because she didn't do life-saving measures? Well, we've already talked about the fact that she did not know CPR, that she thought she was doing the absolute correct thing with some wet towels on Damon's back. This just doesn't hold much weight. You can't really blame somebody for not knowing something. So I think the whole deal about life-saving measures, and there's a police officer that says, oh, she didn't do what I told her to do. Well, he didn't do it either. And so I think it becomes a whole moot point. I think the CPR bullshit just ought to be taken out of this trial, frankly.
Johnson, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, even if she did know CPR or anything else as far as first aid, her kids have been murdered in front of her. Like, you can't expect someone to do that, even if they do know what to do. Because you never know if someone's like in shock or frozen or, whatever.
Yeah, she's on the phone with 911, which is the first thing that I think anybody would do. And I agree. If you've ever been in a chaotic situation like this, say you've been in a car wreck, or, I had a event happen in my life where one of my friends committed suicide, and I walked in to find them, and it seems like a blur. Some people say that their whole life flashes before them before they die. Some people say that time freezes. I think that this is just, again, something that everybody would handle differently, and you really can't speak to how you would handle it unless you've ever been in a situation like this.
I mean, even if you have been in a situation like that, everyone reacts differently. So,
Right, and remember that this is in a 5-minute period. And Darlie is also injured herself, and we're going to get back into that right now.
Damon's loaded into the ambulance. Darlie's loaded into the ambulance. Darlie ends up in the emergency room, and a Dr. Santos, who is the trauma surgeon on call for the ER, examines Darlie as she comes in. He examines her and uses the word superficial to describe what he can see. Okay? There's a lot of back and forth about this term superficial. If I look at a patient superficially, it means that as you walk into the room, I'm kind of giving you the head to toe. I'm assessing, whether you're bleeding out or whether you're coughing.
She's checking you out.
She's bleeding, obviously, from the neck, and Dr. Santos takes her to the emergency room because they need to stop that bleeding, and he needs to know the source of the bleeding. So they take her to exploratory surgery. They stitch her up. Her wound was within 1 to 2 millimeters of her carotid artery. If it had nicked into her carotid artery, or if it had injured it deeper, it was a nick. So if it had gone deeper or wider or lengthier, she would have bled out. There's no doubt about it, because your carotid is an artery and it spurts. And so it does not take long for a body to empty itself of blood in that case. The other thing that I think is kind of really interesting, and I've never really found anything about this, but y'all stay with me here. When Darlie was first admitted to the emergency room, either that or in the ambulance, some vials of blood were taken from her. Okay. One of those vials of blood was used to run a complete blood count. Now, and that's called a CBC. And one of the parts of a CBC is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin's what carries the oxygen in your blood. So if you don't have hemoglobin, you're not going to live very long. And usually transfusion happens, it depends on who you are and how sick you are, but usually around 6 to 7, okay? The normal for hemoglobin is around 11 to 12-ish. Darlie's was on the low end of normal as she admitted into the hospital. I assume that the low end of normal is because she's already lost some blood, okay? And really, hemoglobin is a picture of a point in time. It is not what's been happening in your body. Those of you who are diabetic understand what your hemoglobin A1C is, and you know that it looks at your blood sugars over time. That's not what hemoglobin does. They take her blood in the middle of the afternoon, that next afternoon, and her Hemoglobin's now dropped 2 grams per deciliter, and so it's 9. Okay, it was on the low end of 11, now it's 9. This is again caused by her blood loss from the ER through the operating room and until they were able to stitch it up and get the blood. So 12 hours later, she has lost 20% of her blood, and she would have begun to feel a little bit dizzy, a little bit weird. She makes a comment about, I think it's to the police officer, that she feels a little dizzy. I believe that this is where this comes from. Nobody really takes into account that Darlie's kind of seriously hurt.
Well, I had a question about her hemoglobin.
Oh, absolutely.
We know that Darlie testifies about using the vacuum as a crutch while she's on the phone with 911 and everything's going on. Do you think like that corroborates her blood loss, or would it take longer for her to feel those effects?
Yeah, I want you to explain to us how quickly she would have felt the effects of losing blood. Like Johnson said, how would that affect her reaction during this time?
Well, hemoglobin carries the oxygen throughout your body. And I guess you guys know that if you don't have oxygen, you ain't going to think very well. And you'll probably die. So certainly, I think between the time that she was stabbed and she was put into an ambulance, there was probably enough blood loss for her to feel dizzy. Remember, she bled from her neck wound in the foyer of the house. So there's blood all over that floor. There's blood all over the crime scene into the kitchen. There's blood on the porch. So she's lost some blood. She's lost some. And she's probably feeling dizzy. And she may be a little foggy in thought. Because remember, the first place that gets fed oxygen is your brain.
Here, I'll give you a little anatomy lesson real fast. So there's a bunch of bands. Of course, there's some large muscles that help turn your neck from side to side. And the platysmal band is a small band. It's almost a cosmetic band that comes down right behind your ear and it attaches down near your collarbone. And it helps you do micro movements with your head to move up, down, side to side. You have bigger muscles that also help with this, but the platysmal band is kind of an accessory muscle that helps the head move from side to side. And so she's not only nicked and is bleeding, but because that band was cut, she might not be able to move her neck as well. We've never really heard anybody talk about her injuries in a medical way, and a lot of people assume that, again, the word superficial gets used, that these wounds were quote unquote superficial, but guys, that's not the case. Darlie was severely injured and lost a lot of blood. So on that note, when she's in the hospital, the nurses are going to take notes about her stay there. You know, every time, of course, I'm sure most of you guys have been in the hospital for something, but every time they come in, these days, they take their ID, they sign onto the computer, and they update your notes constantly because you have to chart constantly when you're overseeing a patient. We have, and we will post these notes on our social media, but this is not what the nurses are going to testify to on the stand. They're going to testify to something that is almost the opposite of what their notes say. And so my question to you, Jones, is do you think this violates the Hippocratic Oath? And will you tell us what the Hippocratic Oath is?
Well, let's start with the Hippocratic Oath, which says do no harm. So a medical doctor, nurse practitioner, PA, are bound by those rules. Do no harm. Now, I could go off on an essay about this because I think harm and the definition of harm has changed through the last few decades. But at any rate, whatever somebody writes is the truth. It is legal. It becomes a permanent part of the record. What meds they give at what time, what blood pressure is when they take it. But then they turn around on the stand after having been through a little coaching session the night before, which in itself is illegal. And on the stand, they say, oh, she wasn't acting like she was grieving.
We read through all the nurse's notes where she stayed in the hospital stay, but then if you go read the testimony, it is quite different. They do talk a lot about that she has a flat affect. Well, that was never written in any of her charts. The nurses also say that they overhear Darren and Darlie talking about, their story, and they're trying to match up their stories, and they're going over and over and over again. Well, you know what? I bet they were talking about the death of their two children. I mean, if this had happened to me and my husband, I'd be in the hospital 24/7 saying, how did this happen? How did this happen? Why? What do you think, to my husband? So, as Joan stated, this is illegal. So the nurse's notes, which is a legal document, goes in direct violation of what the nurse's notes are. And do you have anything to say about that, Johnson? Because now we're going to get into the autopsies. They pull their own pathologist forward to describe the autopsies of the boys, but also the autopsy of Darlie. So before we get into that, do you have anything else you need to say, Johnson, about this?
Yes, I need to ask. You mentioned that the nurses had a coaching session the night before. Now, are you discussing was this a deposition or was this some other kind of meeting?
This was the prosecution in a room with the nurses, asking questions and kind of coaching them about how to say the things that he needed them to say on the stand.
So is that not what a deposition is?
I would
Yeah.
assume, I'm not a legal expert, but I would assume a deposition should involve the defense. Am I wrong?
I think my thought is, even if you're, say, practicing or coaching somebody, which we know that they do, they coach people before they go on the stand, they're not supposed to change their wording or their mind or their opinion. They're just supposed to tell them how to state it in the best way, because sometimes when you're on the stand and you get cross-examined and there's all these questions flying at you, most of the time coaching is answer yes or no and keep your answers as short as possible until you're asked a secondary or tertiary question about that. I think a deposition, like Johnson is kind of stating, is where, yes, maybe they have a mock trial, but the prosecutor is not supposed to say, oh, Nurse Jones, I don't want you to state that Darlie was grieving. I want you to state that she had a flat affect and that she didn't care. Now that's illegal. Do we have
Now that's illegal.
Now that's illegal. Do we have anything else that you guys want to say? And honestly, if any of our fans have questions about this, or you have comments, or you have answers, because we are not, Jones is a medical professional, but we are not lawyers. So if you guys have anything to add to that, please email us, because it's very, very quite interesting. The defense calls forward a separate medical examiner from Bexar County, which is San Antonio, and his name is Dr. DeMaio.
And just a reminder, there is a copy of both the autopsies on our website and Facebook.
DeMaio is going to corroborate in some ways what the prosecution, the medical examiners that are on the stand for the prosecution, they cannot nail down that is the exact murder weapon. They cannot state in which order that the boys were killed in. Now, our blood expert at some point, Bevel, he's going to say that Darlie must have been the first bleeder because of the way the mixtures of the blood occur, and we are going to get into DNA later in this case. And so Dr. DeMaio is going to reconfirm what the medical examiner states, which is they don't really know. Really, what I think he brings to the table is, if Darlie would have died that night and she ended up on Dr. DeMaio's autopsy table, what he would have to say about her wounds. And this is especially important for those of you who think that Darlie self-inflicted her own wound. So let me hand it back over to Jones, and she is going to go through Darlie's wounds according to medical examiner Dr. DeMaio.
So I think the first thing is Dr. DeMaio brings to the table what we just talked about in terms of hemoglobin, and he does mention hemoglobin. Second is he says that is not a superficial wound. If you touch the platysmal band, which Darlie's was, it was nicked, then it becomes a trauma wound, a deep wound. It is no longer a superficial wound. So even though Dr. Santos looks from head to toe on Darlie and says, okay, I don't see anything massive. I don't see a knife sticking out of her belly button. And DeMaio says, no, it was a deep wound. And if she had died, I would have called it homicide. The prosecution does not want to talk about the bruises on Darlie's arms. And we've got those bruised pictures on social media. The night she comes into the ER, those bruises are not highly evident. The only thing evident is a stab wound. Again, you either believe it's self-inflicted or that it was inflicted by an intruder. The way that bruises appear is different for every people because it really depends on the capillary system, how much hemoglobin you have, how sick you are you on blood thinners, blah, 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 blah. Your diet. So as she gets out of the hospital, and particularly when she is arrested 18 days later, her right arm is really black and blue. Could she have done that? Could she have bruised her own arm by grabbing it and twisting it with her left non-dominant arm? And the nurses say, never saw those bruises, didn't exist. She made that all up. She self-inflicted them after she got out of the hospital. And what her family and Darren say is, you guys missed it. You never charted it. You don't want to talk about it because it means you missed it.
And so when Darlie's admitted into the hospital about 5 a.m. that morning after she gets out of surgery, 5 or 6, A, they've already talked to Darren, and B, they go in to talk to Darlie, and she's just out of surgery, and she's still on some anesthesia and some Ativan, Xanax type drugs. And the psychiatrist, Dr. Clayton, who we have talked about, is going to state that when you're under these substances, it's harder to keep a lie together because you're not really thinking as clearly as you would be if you were not on drugs. And so Darlie's story remains the same even after she just got out of surgery. She sticks with the story that an intruder came in and that is what happened. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about this. So me and my husband, I had a really fun game for us to play one day. So, of course, my husband knows that I do podcasting. He knows that I've been on the Darlie Routier case for quite some time now. He doesn't know the ins and outs of any of these cases. I mean, if you asked him about the Darlie Routier case, he would say, oh, is that the case that, 2 children died or whatever. But at any rate, so one day I have paint out and I tell him, hey, I'm going to lay on the sofa. I want you to act like you're an intruder and that your motive is to hurt me or to rape me. And
Date night.
Yeah, it's a fun date. And and I can't believe that we did this. Anyways, okay. So he stands over me and he acts like he's going to go in and attack me. I put my right arm, which is my dominant arm, I put it right up in front of my face in the defensive pose. Darlie is stabbed right there on the ulnar bone, which is on the outside of your forearm. So if you hold your arm and a fist right above, defend yourself against an attack. She's stabbed right there. The bruises, and I had my husband cover his hands in paint, and the way he has to grab her to hold her down is exactly the type of bruising that the pictures show. It's a lot of bruising that comes down from the wrist, or where he stopped her arm at the elbow joint, kind of the ditch of your elbow. And I can provide pictures of this on our social media. He then acted like he was going to slit my throat. And one of the things that Dr. DeMaio testifies to is if you're receiving a neck wound from a knife, your body will automatically tense up and pull away, even if you don't have really room to do that. And so there is a gap in Darlie's neck wound where Dr. DeMaio says started to cut her throat. her body subconsciously tenses up. So it starts up kind of where a choker would lay, right below your ear on the right side, and it goes down across her midline, across her sternum, and it ends up on the left side of her collarbone. And we're going to post pictures. We did, but
We
we're going to
did.
post in this episode, we're going to post more of the bruising, because I know that I wanted to wait until this episode to post the bruising. And another thing about bruising that I want to say is that the deeper the bruise, or these are contusions. These are more than just bruises. The deeper that contusion is, the longer it takes to show up. And so in that time, a lot of people that came to visit say they can start to see where the bruising is. But a week later, after she's out of the hospital, I mean, these bruises are extremely dark. So you guys will be able to check those out on our social media.
Saying is exactly where he grabbed you is where Darlie's bruises were.
Yes, and like I said, my husband does not know. Had not seen a picture of Darlie. He did not know exactly what happened. All I said was, I want you to hold me down as if your motive was to rape me. I'm going to defend myself. I want you to stab me in the right arm at some point and try and slit my throat. And I will post those pictures of this experiment, because you know what? No one in this case even ever did an experiment to that level. I mean, nobody even reenacted any of this. No one even really charted her bruises or took a ruler or anything after the fact. And so these bruises, to this day, the Darlie did it community says that she self-inflicted these wounds after she got out of the hospital. But I mean, how? She would have had to have a second party. I mean, Darren would have had to have stomped on her, taken a rolling pin, and deeply, I mean, these bruises are not just I hit my leg on the side of the table. These bruises go deep into the anatomy of Darlie's arms. Last episode, Johnson introduced us to two characters that played a major role in the prosecution's testimony, and those two people were Charles Lynch and James Cron. If you remember, Lynch was our trace evidence expert, and Cron was a investigative fingerprint expert. At the time, Lynch had just gotten out of rehab for alcoholism and depression. Do we think this plays a part in his testimony? I don't know. And obviously, in the last episode, we talked about suicide and we talked about depression. And we're not trying to say that it's a bad thing that he went to rehab for his issues. But what we are saying is, was he mentally prepared to get up on the stand and to testify in a capital murder case? That's for you guys to, think about. But one of the questions that we had was, who called Cron that morning? Because he was retired. How did he find out about this murder? We believe that the Rowlett Police Department called James Cron in as a contractor of sorts, because they were just at a loss. I mean, they had never seen a murder like this. Most of them had never worked a homicide. Some of these beat cops had never done anything like this. So they call Cron in, and Cron shows up about 6 a.m. and Lynch shows up about noon that morning. One of the things that the prosecution present, Darlie took the bread knife out of the knife block and she cuts the window. She then replaces that bread knife and takes out a butcher knife, which becomes the murder weapon for Devin and Damon. The reason that they think the bread knife was used to cut the screen is because Lynch looks under the microscope for some fibers with an S, fibers that were on the knife, and he compares those under a microscope to the screen. And that is how the prosecution builds a case that states Darlie took the bread knife out of the block so that she could then cut the screen with it. However, I have two main issues with this. My first issue is he looks under a microscope to view these two pieces of evidence. And one of them instead of running them through a mass spectrometer, which if you guys, again, watch Forensic Files, you know, but basically it breaks down the chemicals in whatever substance you put into this machine. So this machine and this technology was completely available at the time, and Lynch decided not to use it. So he compares this trace evidence from the bread knife, fibers off the bread knife, and takes pieces of the Routier screen and compares them under a microscope and says, yeah, it's a match. However, there's no pictures of this. We've never seen a picture because you can take pictures with a microscope, and that is something that we never see. And he also never runs it through a mass spectrometer. And so it's kind of like, if you want to compare it to blood evidence, being like, oh, well, they were both type A blood, but then a mass spectrometer would give you a DNA profile. And so, he's just looky-looing these two pieces of evidence. And to us, that just means diddly squat. And so I also, in reading my appeals, so a lawyer named Stephen J. Cooper takes over Darlie's case after she's found guilty. And when they go find the evidence where Lynch matched these pieces of evidence, first of all, he says that there are traces of multiple pieces of fibers. We learn much later that there was only one fiber found on the bread knife. And the Routier family, Darren especially, states that they used that knife to open up the family mail. And sometimes when you open up mail, on the top of an envelope, there's kind of like that silver stamp or silver protection over the top of mail. And so the question has always been, was that fibers off of an envelope, or were those fibers actually off the screen that the supposed intruder came through? Another thing is that this knife block was all bagged together, and so there's a contamination issue. So I'm going to hand it over to Jones, and she's going to give us her opinion about this knife theory and poke holes in the prosecution's theory that the bread knife is the knife that cut the screen, and then she's going to continue on with more forensic evidence.
Well, I guess my question is, if Darlie went to the knife block and she removed the bread knife, who removes a bread knife to cut a screen when you're in the process of staging, quote, a murder of two young children? Don't you pull the sharpest knife? So my question about all this knife block evidence is, if Darlie was supposedly the perpetrator of the crime, okay, she takes the bread knife, slits the screen, puts the bread knife back in the bread block, and then supposedly the perpetrator takes another knife to actually commit the crimes. So that's a little sketchy to me. Yeah, our theory is that the bread knife was never used. Whatever Lynch found was one piece of something. Darren states that that's the knife that they used to open mail. So, I just don't really, I have some questions about that. The next thing that happens, and this is huge, and it still doesn't make sense, and I've reviewed this about 10 million times. The prosecution doesn't want to delve into the sock that was found 3 houses down at 5:30 in the morning.
The sock does not fit. You must acquit. It does not fit into the prosecution's timeline.
That's right.
It's a big thing, this sock.
So, the sock has blood spots on it, and it was found about 75 yards from the back of the Routier house, and that is 225 feet. DNA analysis of those blood spots reveals that there were separate spots of blood with both boys' DNA. So spot number 1 and spot number 2. The sock was supposedly Darren's sock and had some DNA of Darren's on the inside of the toe. There was no blood DNA found on the sock of Darlie's, but what was found of Darlie's is some epithelial cells from the inside of her mouth. Epithelial cells typically line all the mucosal membranes, and that's what they're finding as residue on the sock that was found 225 feet from the back. They find the sock about 5:30, so that is 3 hours after the crime. It was found next to a drain, and the drain required a city key to be able to open it. So the testimony of the policeman is, I looked visually, I looked with my eyes down into the drain, didn't see anything, never got the key to it, and we never examined if there could have been, would have been, should have been any more evidence in that drain. So again, not a great investigative job. The state cannot explain how Darlie could have gotten the sock into the alley without leaving a trail of blood around where the sock was, because the children we know are dead because obviously their blood's on the sock. So the kids had to have been stabbed. And how'd she get it down the alley if in fact she'd already stabbed them and there's no blood in the alley? There's not Devon's, there's not Damon's, there's not Darlie's.
And remember that you can say, oh, well, she planted the sock before her injuries. Like Jones just said, well, there's already blood from the children on that sock. One would think that the sock was placed there after the boys had been stabbed. Now, you could say, well, then she stabbed the boys and ran the sock down. Remember that the ME gives us a pretty tight timeline that Devon could not have stayed awake for more than 7 to 9 minutes. So even if we take 9 minutes, Darlie's on the phone for 5. She has to run the sock down the alley, and then she has to come back and slit her own throat, and then stage the scene and get on the phone with 911. And we've worked out several timelines under several different circumstances, and according to what we have found and all the testimony that we went through in this trial, the prosecution does not want to talk about the sock because why, Johnson?
Because it doesn't fit, so they must acquit.
Woo! Okay. And so really the sock is the prosecution's downfall. They can't fit it into the timeline, and they can't explain how there's blood on it.
We have talked extensively about the screen on the window. We've talked about how high the screen was. We also, Cron, as he's going through the house, says there is no blood in the garage that leads me to believe that the perpetrator was here. Well, when the blood evidence guy gets out after lunch, they do find a drop of blood in the garage.
Yeah, so the drop of blood is Darlie's, and as Jones stated, the entire prosecution's theory is that there's no forensics outside of the Routier home. Well, that's not true, because there is the sock and there is this drop of blood that, again, the prosecution, they don't want to talk about it, but Mulder's going to bring it up in his cross-examination. The drop of blood was found far enough in the garage that it wasn't like it could have been cross-contamination from one of the police, say, stepping on a droplet of blood in the house and then carrying it into the garage, because there wasn't a pattern. This was a singular drop that was 4 to 5 feet into the garage. And at one point, I believe that it was the photographer, Officer Main, steps in it and creates a blood crescent. And so the blood was still A, somewhat wet, and B, it was not contamination that one of the officers had pulled in walking through the crime scene. And Maine is our photographer, if we forgot to say that. His name is Officer Mayne, Officer Maine. I believe he's the one that tracks the blood through. He can't take pictures. This crime scene would have been a lot better if Maine never set foot in it. Or if Cron never set foot in it. But at any rate, during cross-examination, when Dog Mulder asks Cron about this blood spot, Cron does admit that he can no longer see very well. And that is his answer to why and how this blood drop got into the garage. He doesn't want to admit that he misses this piece of evidence, but our serologist which is a blood expert, not a blood analyst or a blood splatter analyst, but a serologist is just a blood a blood expert. Her name is Catherine Long. She is the one that finds this drop of blood, and she does testify about it in court. And so the next thing we're going to talk about is the gate.
Part of what occurred before the Crimes Act is Darlie asked Darren to go to the backyard and to try and fix the fence that comes in from the alley cul-de-sac. And so Darren, it's not shutting properly. The boys use the gate in and out coming in off of the alley all the time. They throw their bikes in the garage, that kind of thing. Darlie asked Darren to go out and fix the gate, and he confirms that he fixes the gate. However, when one of the police officers gets there around 4 o'clock in the morning, he cannot open the gate and he has to kick it down. So did Darren fix it? Did the police officer mess up a shabby fence repair job? I don't know what happened, but the gate evidence, whether it's closed, fixed, not fixed, never makes sense to us.
And I think what Jones is trying to state is that the intruder, if there was an intruder, he would have had it gone through that gate and he would have walked through the path, because last episode we talked about the mulch. And if you go look at our pictures, you literally see that the mulch is right next to the walkway, and it would have taken 0.1 more seconds to walk down that concrete pathway as it would have been to walk through the mulch. So we're not really on the mulch bandwagon, even though the prosecution sure is. Did the intruder open the gate? Did Darren fix the gate? Did the intruder hop the fence? Another question that we have that we're going to go over is the motion light that is attached to the spa. So in our last episode, I believe, Johnson, you put the picture of the spa up there. And if you look at that picture, at the very top of it, you can see a motion light. Did you put that picture up?
Sorry, no, it's in the photos from episode 1.
Okay, and so that Redwood Spa that we've talked about a couple of times, there's a motion light. Well, the motion light was off when the first police officer arrived. So a lot of people say, oh, well, this means that Darlie did it because she never set off the motion detector. But somebody had to run that sock down the alley. And so in my personal opinion, I don't know this, but I don't think the light was pointed at the fence garage area. I think it was pointed towards the sliding glass door so that when the Routiers went out to go get in the spa or bring, drinks or food or whatever out there, that the motion light would automatically kick on. And what Johnson is alluding to is that when we get into fingerprints, there are unknown fingerprints on the sliding glass door. So did the intruder try the sliding glass door, and maybe possibly that spa light went off and the intruder was in the house for more than 18 minutes?
I suppose his fingerprints could have been from a previous peeping Tom situation, and they were older than the night of the crime.
That could be true, and we're going to definitely talk about these prints on the sliding glass door when we get into our conspiracies and our own theories. But just remember that the light is off. So if Darlie ran the sock down the alley and she doesn't set the light off, A, she knew how to get around the light, or B, she would have left her front door, which we just really do not believe that she would have left the front door and ran all the way around the house, all the way down the alley, and then come back in through the front door, because that would have taken quite a few more minutes than if she just left out the back door. So again, as Johnson just stated, we believe this is not the first time that the intruder has been around the Routier home, and we believe that he knew the ins and outs and the doors and the map of the house, and had he snuck in there maybe once when the family was away, had he been peeping, it seems like maybe he did figure these things out as he was stalking Darlie. But we will get into our own personal theories and stuff in the next episode, which I'm just really excited about. But now we're going to go from the outside forensics to inside. So there is a bloody fingerprint that is on the door frame between the laundry room and the garage. So again, last episode we told you guys to go look at the map of the house, and a lot of houses are set up like this. You enter the house through the garage and you walk through a laundry room first. And this is how the Routier house was. And there is a bloody fingerprint on the door that leads from the laundry room into the garage, and the print has never been matched, and it was left in Darlie's blood. She bled there, and the intruder then accidentally stuck his finger in it as he was leaving, and we are going to put it up. And this is a very important print because it shows that there is an unknown person in the Routier home, and that person has left their fingerprint in Darlie Routier's blood.
How much more of a smoking gun can you have? You have their fingerprint in the victim's blood. It's crazy.
Yeah, not only that, but I mean, just going backwards, we have a drop of blood that was left in the garage, where most people that have studied this case say, well, there was no evidence found outside the home. I mean, that's just not true. We have fingerprints on the sliding glass door. We have the drop of blood in the garage. We have the sock. Now we have a fingerprint on the door that goes between the garage and the utility room.
Is this 85J?
So actually, because the defense puts forward this piece of evidence, it is labeled as Exhibit 132. We're going to get into 85J because it's, again, a very interesting.
Call it the print.
Okay, perfect. So this print is legally Exhibit 132.
This print left in Darlie's blood is a fingerprint fragment, which you might be like, oh, well, you can't really match a fragment. But actually, most of the fingerprints taken from scenes are fragments, because you would know if you've ever been fingerprinted, you're not going to naturally roll and press your whole finger around while you're just doing random things. So you really only get part of that fingerprint. But I mean, in not most cases, but some cases, that's enough. Yeah, so Darlie's mistrial attorneys, we're jumping in the feature now, they have had 3 separate experts who said that this print, it's not Darlie's, it's not Darren's, it's not any of the friends or anyone whose prints they took to exclude. And to this day, it has not been matched that we know of. And
it has not. So it's an it's an unknown print.
Even when you do have enough to run through CODIS, I mean, everyone puts a lot of stock in it. I think I've mentioned this before. CODIS is not the end-all be-all database that people think it is. And it's only one very specific section of fingerprints that have been collected from individuals. It's not a database that is connected to every agency and every place in the United States. So every station is required to submit to them either, which is crazy.
Right. And, I don't know if, well, yes, I do know for sure that they ran some of these prints through CODIS, because we're going to talk about that next episode. I'm going to move on to the actual knife now. So we've gone from the outside, the screen door, the light being turned on, print number 132, and now I'm going to talk about the murder weapon. So in the 911 call, we hear that Darlie talks about the knife. However, she was prompted 2 times by the 911 operator about where this knife was, and Darlie said that she had picked it up and put it on the counter. Now, a lot of people, again, are saying, oh my God, why would you move around a crime scene, or why would you pick that up? First of all, I feel like she might have picked it up for self-defense. I mean, the intruder threw it back, and maybe that's a big question that Cron states in his testimony, is why would the intruder have armed Darlie with her own weapon? But I believe the intruder thought that he had almost killed her, and so arming her was not of any worry, because he knew exactly how to sneak out through the garage, jump the fence, open the fence, whatever, and get out. Another point is, as a mom, if there's a knife on the floor, I would automatically pick it up too. So I think there's several things going on in her mind there. And I think a lot of people say, well, she touched the murder weapon and she keeps talking about the murder weapon. She doesn't keep talking about it. The 911 operator asks her about it 2 separate times in the call. And if you go back and listen to episode 1, you can hear that. Again, going back to fingerprints, when they tested the knife, the handle of the knife was not conducive to fingerprints, and so no fingerprints have ever been taken off of the knife. And I think that Darlie begins to hyper focus on the knife because it's really the only sure thing that could possibly point them in the direction of who could have done this. And the fact that she touched the knife when she picked it up from the laundry room and placed it on the kitchen island, I think she feels very guilty about this. And like I said, she doesn't talk about it until she's prompted by the 911 operator. If you look at a picture of the knife, it is not very bloody when the pictures are taken. And it's sitting right where she left it on the island, or I think the end of the bar. And one of the things that we talked about last episode is that if she would have thrown it on the laundry room floor, it should have made a horizontal mark. Bevel is out there doing his blood experiments. He tries to recreate this. And there is a blood marking on the carpet in the living room. And it does leave a horizontal mark from where the blade touched the carpet and landed on it. The forensic experts automatically assume that when Darlie throws, this is their theory, that when Darlie throws the knife down in the laundry room, that it should have also left that same mark that it left in the carpet. Well, there's a lot of different variables there. First of all, at that time, the knife really was not very bloody, and I know this because of the pictures they took of the knife. And second of all, it's a different material. I mean, carpet is more absorbent and it sticks up higher than, say, the linoleum that was in the laundry room. Okay, guys, so I hope you enjoyed this episode of Darlie. I am going to try and get the next episode, the defense part 2, out as quickly. We already have it recorded and everything. I just need to put an edit, so I'm hoping to have that done by the end of this week. And our next episode, we are going to talk about theories, and then we're going to get into conspiracies. So we still might have definitely a few more episodes coming your way. Originally, we called this a 3-part series, and we're learning. And we decided, since we did do so much research into this case, that we might as well put out the best content for you guys. We are Kitchen Table Research, and we do the research, and we have been doing this research for over a year, as you guys know. And so we just decided that we would present the entire story to you. It seems like on our stats on our podcast publisher that these episodes have been downloaded by far more than any of our other content. And so our goal for next season is to present one big case like this, and then maybe present some side cases and some deep dives off the original case as we go. But this took us longer than we thought. And so for next season, we're going to kind of shake things up a little bit and do a different recording. And so again, we hope you guys stick with us because we are still learning, and we hope that you've noticed our audio is getting better. But we love all of our fans. We hope you guys have a good day. You guys stay safe, and we will be in your ears soon. Thank you.